Snow fell thick and quiet on the streets of Boston that Christmas Eve. Twinkling lights wrapped around lampposts and carols drifted from open shop doors. Inside Green Lantern Bistro, warmth pulsed like a heartbeat. The restaurant was packed. Families filled every table. Children laughed between mouthfuls of pasta, and couples clinked glasses in soft candlelight. Leah Hart stood just inside the door, brushing a few snowflakes from her coat. Her emerald green dress, chosen carefully for tonight, hugged her figure gently, the color making her blue eyes stand out. Her hair fell in soft blonde waves down her shoulders, slightly damp from the snow, and a touch of hope still clung to her smile as the hostess guided her to table 9. It was her first blind date in over a year. Her best friend, Rachel, had been persistent. "You never know, Leah. He's a decent guy, smart, single. At least meet him." So she had said yes. For a while, she sat alone trying not to look at the time. The table was beautiful. Linen cloth, a small flickering candle in a silver holder, and 2 polished wine glasses waiting to be filled. Leah checked her phone once, then again. The server came by and offered water. She smiled politely, waved it away. He was only 15 minutes late. Then 20. Then 35. At minute 40, Evan arrived. He was tall and well-dressed, but the moment he saw her, he sighed, an audible, disappointed breath. His eyes swept over her in a way that made her stomach tighten. He sat across from her with a slouch, didn't apologize, didn't offer an excuse. "So," he said, barely glancing at the menu. "You're Rachel's friend?" Leah nodded, smiling nervously. "Yes, and you must be." "I'm Evan," he cut in, pulling out his phone to glance at a message. "Look, I'll be honest. I came because my mom won't stop setting me up. She wants grandkids. I'm not really looking. Especially not for someone." He paused, waving a vague hand at her. "More assertive than me. I don't do well with that. And you kind of give off that vibe." Leah's smile cracked, then disappeared altogether. "I like softer types," he added with a shrug. "So, yeah, no hard feelings, right?" He stood before she could respond, brushing non-existent lint from his coat. "Merry Christmas," he said flatly, and walked out without a backward glance. Leah sat frozen, the sounds of holiday joy swelling around her like an ocean rising to drown her. She placed her trembling hand on the edge of her dress, smoothing the fabric over her lap as if that might quiet the shaking. She turned slightly, angling her face toward the wall, away from the nearest table of laughing diners. Her throat tightened. She blinked hard. The candle between the 2 empty wine glasses flickered gently, casting golden light against her untouched glass of water. Its small flames seemed to whisper her loneliness back to her. It wasn't just about Evan. It was about every dinner date that had ended in awkward silences. Every man who said, "You're great, just not for me." Every hopeful beginning that led nowhere. She had turned down an invitation to spend Christmas Eve with her family for this. For him. For a chance. She told herself it was okay to want love, that being 30 and single wasn't a curse, that someone somewhere would see her. But right now, she felt like the only woman in Boston who had been stood up on Christmas Eve. A breath caught in her chest, sharp and painful. She couldn't stay here. Not one more second. She reached for her coat. But before she could slide from her chair, a tiny voice rose from below the edge of the table. "Excuse me, why are you sad?" Leah looked down, startled. Standing next to her chair was a little girl, no older than 3, with soft brown curls framing her round cheeks. She wore a red velvet dress and clutched a small knitted bear in one hand. Her hazel eyes blinked up at Leah, wide and serious. Leah blinked at her, stunned. The little girl tilted her head. "Do you need a hug?" she asked softly. And in that moment, something in Leah's chest cracked, not from pain, but from the softest, most unexpected kind of mercy. Leah stared down at the small figure beside her chair. "Do you need a hug?" the girl asked again, her voice sweet, calm, and terribly sincere. Leah didn't know how to respond. Her heart, already cracked open, softened completely. She managed a shaky smile. "That's a very kind offer." The girl nodded solemnly. My name is Ruby. I'm 3. She held up 3 fingers. My daddy says hugs help, especially when someone's face looks all droopy. A soft chuckle escaped Leia before she could stop it. She blinked quickly, not trusting herself to speak. A voice came from a few feet away, calm, low, careful. Ruby. Leia turned her head. A man stood near a table just a few steps behind them. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with short dark hair and a strong, gentle presence. His black knit sweater clung to broad shoulders, and his coat, still dusted with snow, was draped over the back of a chair. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes, gray with a hint of storm, were warm. Concerned. He stepped forward slowly, placing one hand over Ruby's small shoulder. I'm so sorry, he said, offering Leia a quiet, respectful nod. Ruby's very friendly. She doesn't really understand personal boundaries yet. Leia started, her voice catching again. She's wonderful, the man said, his expression softening. I'm Adrian. Adrian Hale. Leia hesitated, then nodded. Leia. Adrian looked at her for a moment, as if taking in the red around her eyes, the candles still flickering between the untouched wine glasses and the slight tremble in her hands. Without a word, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small pack of tissues, and set one gently on the table in front of her. He didn't touch her, didn't crowd her, just placed it there and stepped back. A kindness, so simple it made her throat tighten all over again. Then he crouched beside Ruby, getting eye level with her. Sweetheart, he said gently. Sometimes grown-ups feel sad. And that's okay. But when someone's sad, we have to be extra kind and very gentle with them. Can you remember that? Ruby nodded slowly. I was being gentle. I didn't jump on her. Adrian bit back a smile. You were very gentle. Ruby turned back to Leia, her little brow furrowed in concentration. Then, as if coming to a grand decision, she reached forward and placed one small hand on Leia's. Do you want to eat with us? She asked brightly. My dad makes really good chicken. Well, not makes. He calls and they bring it. But it tastes like he made it. Adrian's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked almost stunned. Ruby, he began, but Leia was already laughing. The laugh caught her off guard, full and real, warming her face for the first time all night. She's persuasive, she said softly, glancing at Adrian. He rubbed the back of his neck, visibly embarrassed. I promise she doesn't usually invite strangers to dinner. Not since last Thanksgiving. Ruby tugged at his sleeve. She's not a stranger. She's Leia. Adrian looked from Ruby to Leia, hesitating. If you don't mind, he said gently, we'd be happy to have you join us. No pressure, of course. Leia glanced down at Ruby's hopeful face, those wide hazel eyes still locked onto hers. There was no agenda in them, no judgment, just pure open-hearted kindness. And in that moment, Leia felt something shift. No one had ever chosen her like this before. Not first. Not so instinctively. Not so simply. She looked at Adrian, then back at Ruby. I'd like that, she said softly. I'd like that very much. Ruby beamed and reached for her hand again. Adrian's shoulders relaxed. And for the first time that night, Leia felt warmth from more than just the restaurant's candlelight. This was not how she imagined her Christmas Eve. But maybe, just maybe, it was how it was meant to be. The host led them to a quieter corner of the restaurant where a small round table was tucked beneath a frosted window. Ruby immediately climbed into the center seat and patted the chairs on either side of her. You sit here, she said to Leia. And you sit here, she told Adrian. We're like a sandwich. Adrian raised an amused brow, pulling out Leia's chair before settling into his own. Ruby placed her bear on the table like a fourth guest and began chatting the moment they were seated. There's a cat that lives on our street, she began, swinging her legs. He's orange and grumpy and stole my cheese once. I named him Pudding, but Dad calls him Menace. Also, snow tastes different when you catch it with your tongue. And guess what? I saw Santa today. Leia laughed, really laughed, for the first time that night. She glanced at Adrian and saw a faint smile playing on his lips as he gently unfolded a napkin and laid it across Ruby's lap. "Small bites, please," he said, slicing Ruby's grilled chicken into neat pieces. He reached for another napkin and laid it carefully over Leia's lap, too. "In case the snow followed you in," he said softly, almost shyly. A waiter appeared with their drinks. Adrian passed a steaming cup of tea to Leia without a word, as if it had been natural, expected. Her hands wrapped around the warmth, and she looked at him. Really looked. This wasn't just a man playing father. This was a man who had fully become one. Ruby munched on a fry, then turned to Leia with her mouth full. "Do you know what I really want for Christmas?" Leia smiled. "What's that?" "A mommy," Ruby said brightly. "Can you be mine?" The question dropped into the space between them like a pebble in still water. Adrian froze. Leia blinked, stunned. Even Ruby seemed to realize something had shifted. She looked up at her father, then back at Leia. Waiting. Leia cleared her throat softly, reaching to tuck a strand of hair behind Ruby's ear. I don't know, sweet girl," she said carefully. "But you're so wonderful. I think anyone would want to be part of your family." Ruby accepted the answer with a small nod, though her eyes remained hopeful. Adrian let out a slow breath and met Leia's gaze, apologetic. "She doesn't fully understand what happened," he said, voice low. "She was only one when her mom passed. Sometimes she talks like this, and I don't always know how to handle it." There was something in the way he said it, not just an apology, but a confession. One that carried the weight of being both a parent and a man terrified to open his heart again. Leia gave a gentle nod. "You're doing better than you think." He looked up at her then, really looked, and she felt something stir in her chest. Not romantic yet, but deeply human. Recognition. Respect. Ruby, oblivious to the tension, reached for a piece of bread and nibbled at it. Leia slid her hand across the table and gently clasped Ruby's small fingers. "You're doing okay too, you know," she whispered. Ruby turned to Adrian, beaming. "Daddy, she's not sad anymore. I did it. I fixed her." Adrian's face softened completely. He looked at his daughter, then at Leia. The woman his child had somehow pulled into their lives like a beam of light on the darkest night of the year. And in that shared glance, something passed between them. No promises, no expectations, just quiet understanding, gratitude, connection. And the beginning of something neither of them had seen coming. The second time they met was quieter. A small coffee shop overlooked the slow-moving Charles River, its windows fogged from the warmth inside and the cold December afternoon outside. Adrian arrived early. Leia was already there. They chose a corner table by the window. No one else was around except a young barista, humming a carol softly. Ruby was with Helen for the afternoon. Adrian held his cup in both hands and looked at the water, silent for a long while before he spoke. "Her name was Lena," he began, voice low. "We met in college. She was wild and brave, and always late." A slight smile tugged at his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. 3 years ago, she was hit by a drunk driver. Just like that, she was gone. No goodbyes. Ruby was still learning how to say mama. Leia said nothing but curled her fingers around the ceramic mug in front of her. "I didn't know how to grieve and be a father at the same time," Adrian continued. "So, I did the only thing I knew. I built walls around myself. Around Ruby. Around everything." He finally looked at her. "That night at the bistro, when Ruby reached for you, I saw something crack open. And it terrified me." There was no theatrics in his voice, no dramatic flair, just honesty, the kind that only comes from pain lived through. Leia met his eyes. "You're not the only one afraid of trying again." She looked down at the table. "I've never had what you had," she admitted. "Most of the men I dated, they saw me as an option. Something temporary. Like I was never quite enough for the long run." She took a breath. "After a while, you start believing it. That maybe you're the problem. That maybe you're not lovable in the way people want." Adrian didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to fix her. Instead, he simply reached forward, not to touch her, but to turn the silver spoon on the table toward her. "Look at the reflection," he said softly. The polished metal bent her image just slightly, but her eyes were still hers, bright, wounded, real. If they couldn't see her worth, he murmured, they were not the ones who deserved to. The words sank deep. Leia blinked quickly, turning her face to the window so he wouldn't see the tear that escaped. Moments later, the bell above the door chimed softly. Helen entered hand in hand with Ruby, who ran straight toward Leia with a squeal. "Miss me?" Leia laughed and opened her arms. "Always." Ruby scrambled into her lap like she belonged there. And maybe, in some quiet way, she did. She nestled in warm and safe, and within minutes her eyelids began to flutter closed. Leia's arms tightened gently around the small bundle. Her cheek rested against Ruby's hair. Adrian watched, something shifting behind his eyes. He hadn't realized how naturally Leia fit into their life. Not like a replacement, but like a melody they hadn't known was missing from their song. And yet, along with that realization came something else. Fear. He reached out, brushing a stray strand of Ruby's hair away from her cheek. "I'm scared," he said suddenly. "Scared of letting myself feel this. Scared that if I let someone in again and lose them, I don't know if I could take it." His voice cracked at the edges, vulnerable in a way Leia had never seen before. She looked up at him, one arm still cradling Ruby. "I'm scared too," she whispered. "But maybe we can be scared and still try." It wasn't a grand promise. It wasn't an easy answer, but it was enough. Outside, the river glistened beneath a fading sky. And inside that quiet coffee shop, something small, delicate, and real began to grow. Not loud or perfect, but honest. Something like hope. In the weeks that followed, Leia became a gentle presence in the rhythm of Adrian and Ruby's life. It started with small things. A bedtime story where she did all the voices, witches, wolves, and a grumpy dragon Ruby named after her neighbor's cat. Then came mornings when Leia helped Ruby find a missing sock or tied her ponytail just right. 2 loops and a twist, not too tight. Sometimes Adrian stood in the hallway, coffee in hand, watching Leia lean down to kiss the top of Ruby's head before zipping her coat. They would walk Ruby to preschool together, the 3 of them laughing in the crisp air, Ruby skipping between them, swinging their hands. There were no labels, just quiet warmth, a routine that began to feel like home. Adrian, normally guarded, started noticing things. The way Leia tilted her head while listening to Ruby's stories. How calmly she handled tantrums, not with lectures, but with gentle presence. How she'd silently place a glass of water beside his laptop during late work nights. She fit not like a guest, but like someone who had always belonged. Then one Saturday, Helen arrived. Adrian's mother was sharp, elegant, and rarely needed to raise her voice. She came bearing gifts for Ruby and expectations wrapped just as tightly. Leia greeted her warmly. Helen returned the courtesy, but with watchful eyes. At first, she stayed reserved, watching as Leia helped Ruby with a puzzle. But as the visit unfolded, her scrutiny softened. She noticed the quiet gestures, Leia wiping chocolate from Ruby's chin, reminding her to say, "Please." And most telling of all, the way Ruby reached for Leia's hand without thinking. Later in the kitchen, while Leia refilled a juice glass, Helen turned to Adrian. "She's gentle," she said softly. Ruby responds to that. Adrian only nodded. Helen looked toward the kitchen, then added, "Just make sure fear doesn't keep you from seeing what's already growing." It was at preschool that things shifted again. Adrian picked up Ruby one afternoon. Her teacher, Miss Carr, smiled as she handed him a crayon drawing of stick figures. "This is Ruby's family," she said. She flipped the page so he could see. "It's her dad, her grandma Helen." And then she pointed at a third figure. "And she said this is her new mommy, Leia." Adrian stood frozen. Leia hadn't asked for that. She hadn't even been there. And yet, she was the name Ruby chose. When Leia heard about the drawing later, she didn't speak. Her lips trembled. Her eyes shimmered. She rarely cried, but this gentle undoing was too much to hold. That night, she stood by her bedroom window, watching snow fall like it had that first night. She realized she was in deep. Not just with Ruby. With Adrian too. and that scared her more than she could admit. She began pulling back just a little. She declined dinners, shortened visits, answered texts slower. Adrian noticed. He didn't press, but he felt the shift. One evening after Ruby had fallen asleep, he found Leia folding laundry at the dining table. She looked up, surprised. "You're drifting," he said gently. "I don't want to assume, but I need to ask, is it because of me?" Leia's hands stilled on a tiny sweater. "I think I'm falling for this life," she said softly. "For her. For you. And I'm terrified I'm not enough." Adrian walked over, slow and steady. "You don't have to be perfect," he said quietly. "You just have to be real." She looked up at him, and for the first time, neither of them looked away. They were two people standing in the middle of something unexpected. Something fragile, maybe, but honest, the kind of real you could build a home around. The holiday fundraiser was held at the historic Belmont estate, a grand, glittering affair hosted by friends of Adrian's late wife. It was a sea of polished shoes, champagne flutes, and polite smiles. Leia stood beside Adrian in a navy blue dress, her hair curled gently over her shoulders. Ruby twirled nearby in a sparkly gold dress, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Everything was going fine. Until it wasn't. Ruby ran up to a small group of adults laughing and proudly declared, "That's my mommy," pointing straight at Leia. The words, innocent and bright, sliced through the air like glass. The women in the group smiled politely, some exchanging glances. One of them whispered something under her breath. Adrian heard the name Lena. He froze. Before Leia could react, Adrian reached for her arm and gently but firmly pulled her aside, guiding her down a quiet hallway away from the chandeliers and murmurs. His voice was low but trembling.
I'm sorry. I didn't expect that."
Leia blinked, unsure where this was going. "She's just a child," she said softly. "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But these people, they were Lena's friends." And hearing Ruby say that, I panicked. Leia's eyes searched his. "Are you ashamed of me?" "No," he said quickly. "It's not you. It's the idea of Ruby thinking you're a replacement. Like, I'm erasing Lena. I'm not ready for her to think that." The words landed heavy. Leia swallowed. Then maybe I'm the only one who is building something. She turned and walked back through the party alone, her step steady, but her heart cracked clean in two. Adrian did not follow. That night, Leia sat by her window, watching snow tap gently against the glass. She placed her hand on her chest where it ached, not because of rejection, but because she finally understood she had let herself be chosen. And it hurt to feel unchosen again. The next morning, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find no one, only a small envelope taped gently to the handle. Inside was a folded card, the front decorated with crayon hearts and stick figures. In uneven letters, it read, "I want you to be my mommy. Not the old one, a new one. Love, Ruby." Tears blurred her vision. Inside the envelope was something else, her left glove. The one she had lost at the fundraiser, now returned, neatly folded. She held it close to her chest. She wasn't crying because she was hurt. She was crying because someone had remembered, because a child had chosen her again. And this time, it mattered more than anything. That evening, Leia heard footsteps on the stairs. She opened the door before he could knock. Adrian stood there. No umbrella. Snow collecting on his dark coat. His hair damp. His eyes unguarded. He took a shaky breath. "I messed up," he said. Leia said nothing. She simply let him speak. "I was scared. Scared that by letting Ruby love you that way, I was betraying Lena. Scared that I was moving too fast. Or worse, scared that I was feeling too much." He paused, the words hanging in the cold air. "But the truth is, I choose you, Leia. Not to replace anyone, but to build something new together." A tear slipped down her cheek, not from sadness, but because someone had finally spoken the words her heart had been waiting to hear. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, not as a guest in his life, but as someone who finally belonged. Snow had returned to Boston, quiet and soft like a memory finding its way home. Lights twinkled along the windows of the Green Lantern Bistro, casting a golden hue on the sidewalks outside. Inside, a familiar warmth wrapped around Leia's heart as she stepped through the door, her pulse drumming gently in her chest. She saw him immediately. Adrien stood near table number 9. The table, the one where she had once sat alone, holding back tears under the flicker of a single candle. Tonight it looked different. Not because the table had changed, but because she was no longer alone. "Hi," she said, her voice steady but soft. He smiled, nervous in a way that was oddly charming. "Hi." Leia glanced at the table. 2 place settings. And a third smaller one, with a coloring book and a set of crayons neatly arranged. Adrien gestured to the chair across from him. "I thought it was time to come full circle." She sat down, brushing a loose curl behind her ear. "You remembered the table?" "I remembered the woman who sat here," he said, "and how she chose to stay even when the night could have broken her." The waiter brought hot cider for both of them, and a bowl of macaroni for the little girl who would soon be joining them. Adrien took a slow breath. "I didn't bring a ring," he said. Leia blinked, slightly taken aback. "Because I'm not asking for a proposal," he continued. "I'm asking for something more than that." She held his gaze. "Leia, will you become our family? Not as a replacement, not as someone to fill a gap, but as the woman who makes our lives more full, more real, more home." Her hand trembled slightly as she brought it to her mouth. Adrien leaned in, voice low. "We're not asking you to forget who you are. We're asking you to bring all of who you are into who we are." A burst of energy arrived just then. A red velvet dress swishing as Ruby ran from the front entrance straight to Leia. She wrapped her tiny arms tightly around Leia's legs. "Miss Leia," Ruby whispered, tilting her head back, eyes big and pleading. "Do you want to be my new mommy now?" Leia bent down slowly, her eyes already brimming. "I've been waiting for you to ask," she whispered. And then she nodded. Yes. Yes to the little girl who chose her twice. Yes to the man who had the courage to open his heart again. Yes to the family she never thought she would find. Sitting at a table she once believed would mark the loneliest night of her life. Ruby squealed in delight, hugging her tighter. Adrien reached across the table and gently took Leia's free hand. She looked up at him, and for the first time, there was no fear behind her smile. Only peace. Only belonging. And just like that, the table that once held sadness now held something sacred. A beginning. Morning light filtered softly through the kitchen windows, dusting everything with a golden glow. The scent of vanilla and cinnamon hung thick in the air, along with giggles and clattering spoons. Ruby stood proudly on a step stool, wearing an oversized chef's hat that kept sliding down over her eyes. Batter dotted her cheeks, and her small hands worked diligently to stir the mix in a big green bowl. "Celebration pancakes," she announced triumphantly. "Extra sprinkles today for the party." Adrien leaned against the counter nearby, wearing a plain white t-shirt and a navy apron dusted with flour. His sleeves were rolled up, and his smile was easy. Nothing like the buttoned-up CEO the world knew. This was him as he really was. At home. Across the kitchen, Leia set the table, gently placing a flower in a small glass vase. Her movements were peaceful, natural, like someone who had belonged there all along. As Ruby began pouring batter, most of it missing the pan, Helen Hale entered the room. Her heels clicked softly against the tile as she took in the chaos, flour on the floor, syrup already spilled, Ruby humming a holiday song slightly off-key. Leia straightened slightly, unsure how to read her expression. But Helen smiled. She walked toward Leia, placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and said in a calm, steady voice, "Welcome to the family, dear." Leia's eyes watered. It wasn't a grand gesture, not a speech, but it was all she had needed. Recognition. Acceptance. A door opening instead of closing. They gathered around the table as Ruby climbed into her booster seat. A tower of slightly lopsided pancakes sat at the center, crowned with a generous swirl of whipped cream and a crooked strawberry. Ruby picked up her tiny glass of milk, stood precariously on her chair, and raised it high. "I want to make a toast," she declared seriously. Everyone stilled. Ruby cleared her throat dramatically. To my new family and to Mommy Leia. Adrian's breath caught. Leia blinked rapidly, her hands rising to her heart. Helen raised her coffee mug with a soft nod. Even the usually composed Adrian wiped at his eye. Ruby beamed, then plopped back down and began devouring her pancakes with all the grace of a small tornado. Leia watched her. Watched them. She thought back to that cold Christmas night. The table, the rejection, the silence, the overwhelming feeling that perhaps love had forgotten her entirely. But it hadn't. It had simply taken a detour. She hadn't been abandoned. She had been led to a curious little girl in a red velvet dress with a heart wide enough to welcome a stranger. Led to a man who chose to love, not because he had to, but because he saw her. Leia reached out, gently tucking Ruby's hair behind her ear. Then she looked across the table at Adrian, who gave her a look that said everything without a word. This was not a perfect family. It was their family, not born of blood, but of courage, of choosing, of daring to open the door again. And sometimes, just sometimes, the one who chooses you is a 3-year-old in a frosting-covered apron, holding your whole future in her sticky little hands. The camera of life zoomed out slowly as laughter filled the kitchen, and snow began to fall once again outside the window. This time, it did not feel cold. It felt like home.